hurt and you're going to end up with scabs anyway, so I'm just going to love you where you are right now. No! You throw them on the ground and you start rolling them. You get a blanket and you start hitting the flames. And they're going to say, you're hurting me, you're beating me, you're controlling. It's like, no, dear, hold still, I'm getting the fire out. That's what a loving parent does. And because nobody will do it, it looks to the world crazy.
Do you hear this?
Mother of self-reports, Ruby.
I was like, you are way too comfortable sharing all that information.
How's it going, everyone? It's your favorite apostates. I'm McKay.
I'm Jordan.
And
welcome back for part 2.
Welcome back for part 2. We're wearing the same clothes.
For us, it's just 4 hours. Because, part 2.
Yeah, this is 4 hours after the other one.
It's 1:30 in the morning.
Anyway, so we've been talking about Shari's new book. This is the continuation of that. If you did not see the first part, I will link it right here. Boom. So that you can go and check that one out first. That way everything's in context. Otherwise, let's just get on with the discussion. Take it away, Jordan and McKay, from like an hour and a half or 2 hours ago. Enter Jodi Hildebrandt. A monster masquerading as a mental health professional, armed with a tight smile and a mind full of psychological warfare tactics. A monster who would see my mother's inner darkness and cultivate it, nurture it, until it eclipsed all light.
I think this is one of the most powerful quotes in the book.
Didn't she use this to tease?
I don't
beforehand?
remember. Maybe.
I don't know. I think we had seen it because somebody got their hands on the book early.
Yes.
And I was like, oh.
But this is powerful.
Seriously.
I don't think that, I mean, you start off, like, her opinion on Jodi is very clear from the very beginning. And I think, unfortunately, this is one of those things where we did put enough pieces together about Ruby where we had said this, right? Like, we've always said that some of these things existed in Ruby before and Jodi just kind of emboldened them and made them worse. And I think that's exactly what this is describing, right? Is Jodi saw those things in her and grabbed them and said, like, let's go with this. Like, we can run with this.
I discussed this with Jordan, but I related it to, in Mormonism, I think it's a Christian thing too, but like being led down by the devil with a flaxen cord where like slowly over time you're getting your hands bound, right? I think it's a Christian thing. But Ruby already had her hands bound. She was already this way. I think Jodi just put the collar on her and dragged the leash.
One of the things that stood out to me in this book also is Shari's humor. Like, I think she injected humor into some of these places, which I thought was interesting and I think is we can all kind of appreciate.
Real Chandler Bing style.
Coping with humor, you know? Like, one of the quotes that I wrote down that I had to put in here was a quote referencing Jodi, where she said, "Why did this woman in her ugly khaki shorts and long sleeve shirts have such a hold on people?" Like, like addressing, you know, so much of our conversations when we first started covering them and when Jodi first came onto the scene was like, what is it about this woman? I can't even tell you how many clips I have where I simply said, I just want y'all to note what Jodi's wearing right now. And I didn't say anything else.
Constant.
And we'll come back to that point later on. But I just, like, it's interesting to me. I love that she's been able to kind of weave humor through this because that's how a lot of us cope, right?
Shari says that she was initially very weary of Jodi, having done a little bit of research on her. She felt she was absent of nurturing energy and was not warm and comforting.
Which was interesting for somebody in a healing profession, right? I think this is something that stands out to me because, you know, part of our question that we've talked about the entire time these two have been together is like, why the draw? Yeah. Why did these two get so intertwined? What's happening there? And I think this kind of starts to illustrate that point a little bit. Like, I feel like Ruby felt like Jodi kind of spoke to her and called to her on another level because she felt camaraderie in their absence of empathy, particularly for children. Like, if that's something that you even potentially have a hint of shame about, and who's to say whether Ruby really does or not, but then you have somebody else who also thinks the same way, You have somebody else who also thinks that babies are coddled and toddlers shouldn't have tantrums and you're a bad parent if you're letting them do that and you should just be hitting them and shit. Like, if you have somebody else who validates that for you, like, you're going to be so connected because you're like, oh my God, I feel the same way.
Especially in a world where there's this darn bureaucratic red tape of you can't abuse your kids.
It's bad to hit your kids.
It's bad to hit your kids. And then finally someone can confide in you that, oh yeah, I do the same thing. Actually, let me share some tips with you.
She'd be thrilled with that.
Yeah. Sherry also said that Jodi says her mom lost a child and was emotionally distant from her, which, if her mom was emotionally distant from her and Ruby's mom was emotionally distant, birds of a feather, right?
And this isn't even nefarious. Like, if you think about this from any kind of friendship perspective, it's like, oh, I can relate to you. But if we have somebody like Jodi who's potentially manipulating this, like, especially if Ruby found out all this information about Jodi really early on, like, generally getting that deep, that vulnerable, that intimate with somebody really early on in the process can be a red flag. Not always, but it can be. I think that's something to pay attention to.
She said that Jodi recalls no affection from her parents and was actually disturbed by tenderness between her parents and the other children.
Does that sound like anybody else you know?
That's a big red flag. It's also during this time Ruby would eventually cut herself off from her siblings and her parents. This is an area of horrible excellency for Jodi, as we've seen in the case of Adam Paul Steve, where she would get his wife to cut him off for supposedly viewing pornography and masturbating that he wasn't doing, and drive a wedge between them that would eventually get them to separate.
I think this was unfortunately a skill set for Jodi that you use to some degree in my profession.
Yeah.
Right? Where, like, it's not my job to, like, manipulate you to get into your trauma, but it's like part of my job is sitting with people in their pain and things that are vulnerable when they're ready to share them. But I think Jodi took, like, the techniques and things that she had learned in grad school and then used that as, like, a skill set to further manipulate people. Like Ruby, like, she would be using kind of therapeutic techniques to be able to kind of dig in and get in there a little bit deeper and maybe a little bit quicker. And also relying on her, like, base of knowledge and her, like, professional status, where Ruby's automatically going to feel more trustworthy of her and at home with her to share that information. That, to me, like, this whole thing between them and potentially, like, the trauma bonding potentially happening here, like, there seems like there's a lot of stuff happening beneath the surface here.
Sherry stated that Ruby seemed to ignore childhood wounds in the past, but once Jodi came onto the scene, she found that extremely difficult. Isolation is part of control and abuse, and it seems that from the very beginning, Jodi sought to separate Ruby from anyone and everyone who supported her, which seems to be her MO as per other stories that other people have shared after they were arrested and everything like that. Primarily her children and her husband. So Kevin and all the kids, which mostly worked, except for 4 of the kids. Jodi's kids apparently don't talk to her. She's divorced.
Which we knew.
And she must feel very alone. And just to mention, I don't know if we've ever brought this up, Jodi's divorce went on for years.
She
nearly a
dragged
decade.
that shit out for years.
Nearly a decade she went on. To ensure that she doesn't feel alone anymore, she'll help Ruby cut out her family so that Ruby can be more like her, and then they can be 2 little lonely peas in a pod.
And if Ruby has no one, who's she going to rely on? This is like the
Jodi.
codependency handbook, if we were to write one. Like, if you want somebody, like, if you are going to if we look at, like, the wheel of a control, like, I'll have McKay put it on the screen. Like, isolation, a lot of the things that Jodi was doing, I think, was very intentional. Like, I feel like, you know, Jodi sometimes comes off, like, unhinged and a little bit weird and a little bit wild. But the more that I put pieces together, the more I read this book, one of the theories that I've come away from this with is, I think, even though I think Jodi is impulsive and does things that are horrifying and stupid, I also think she was kind of playing 4D chess with this whole thing. It really seems to me, if you put the pieces together of, like, creating someone's who's codependent with you, someone who relies on you, someone like removing someone from their family, financial exploitation and abuse. She hit like every single part of this that would be like a very sophisticated campaign to isolate Ruby to be like her little acolyte, like Shari says. Like, it seems to me, my theory coming out of this is I think Jodi is dumb in a lot of ways, but I also think she had a plan going into this. It seems very clear to me that this did not happen by coincidence. Like, I truly think there was a well-orchestrated, thought-out plan that led to everything we saw happen. Just keep that in mind.
Eventually, over 2 to 3 years, Ruby would go on to systematically cut just about everybody off. Even in the YouTube videos, we can see, like in the last video that they uploaded about their youngest's baptism, there is nobody from Ruby's family that's there.
That's a really interesting
and they
point,
were all pretty tight, and they all live close by. It was just Kevin's family that was there, essentially. So it seems like that was pretty much in full effect by 2022.
Yeah.
When they stopped doing the 8 passengers stuff, and then she transitioned full time into doing the Connexions stuff.
And I mean, I think what's also so insidious about it, especially with like the cutting off the family, is like, you know, we'll be the first to say that if you need to cut off a family member from your life because it's healthier for you, do it. No shade in that whatsoever. But to do like all of them at once.
Yeah.
Or like
so quickly,
just like block out everything. And, you know, sometimes you have a toxic whole family. I'm not going to say that that's not the thing for some people. You know, maybe there are circumstances. But I think one of the most insidious things about this was Jodi is sophisticated enough to know that Ruby didn't even necessarily need to see her hand in any of this, because Jodi didn't need to come up with some lie or some story or something to get Ruby to see why it would be good to cut her family off. Like Shari said that Ruby already had wounds from childhood. Mm-hmm. So Jodi, knowing what she knows, goes, oh, all I have to do is tap into what's already there. Like, they shouldn't have done that to you. That's horrible. That's toxic. That's abusive. And while in some cases those things probably were true and right, instead, it was not for Ruby's healing. It was to get Ruby more under her control. And that, as a mental health professional, is beyond insidious. Like, that is evil.
Yeah.
With that being your intent.
In the beginning, we see that Shari tried to share her concerns with Chad about Jodi, but he told Ruby what her concerns were. He went and
typical little brother behavior.
And Ruby was furious. This shows just how deep Chad was in at that point. I mean, he's a child. Mm-hmm. And
conditioning.
He had gone to this wilderness camp and everything like that. And he was already so beaten down. And Ruby tells Shari that everyone that doesn't like Jodi is hiding something and is threatened by the truth that she speaks. At this point, Jodi had not even been involved that long, but you can already see that the Jodi speak was in full swing. Shari stated that she told Ruby that Jodi's own kids wouldn't even speak to her.
It's sad, and it hurts my heart to watch you behave so selfishly. And Ruby smiled.
I wonder why your daughter probably hates going to your house.
I'm pretty sure all her kids are adults. I'm pretty sure her children are all adults.
Yeah, that sounds like a kid who's going to cut
that's
their
even worse.
off.
I was going to say she's going to be the boomer or Gen Xer in a few years that's like, none of my kids ever come to see me. No, my kids fucking hate me. I don't understand why. I wonder.
Guess
I really
who's
wonder.
Put in a shit home.
Yeah, for real.
If that's how you act toward your kids. And Ruby responded, telling her the truth that her kids couldn't handle the truth, and she's been called by God to help people. And it took absolutely no time at all for Ruby to start eating up this bullshit. It seems pretty obvious that Jodi was very skilled in manipulating, given the skill set that she acquired from her old profession.
I think, there was lots of people in Connexions, right? And we talk about a little bit later on why some of those fell off. But I think she had her eyes on Ruby as soon as Ruby came on the scene from the very start, because I think Ruby was emblematic of everything that she needed everywhere, every possible option that she could take Connections, expand Connections just from like a platform standpoint. But she would have been able to see very quickly with what Shari describes that Ruby was just like, yes, whatever you say,
Yep.
I will do it. Give me more. I want to learn more. You have a handbook. I'll have it memorized by tomorrow. Like, she is the perfect, like, cult follower.
Exactly.
Like, she will blindly worship because she got so sucked in so quickly. And again, we never shade people for getting caught in cults because it happens to the smartest of people, right? Like, you think about it, Kevin is highly educated, an academic, literally a professor, and he was sucked into this bullshit. So this is never to shade anybody who gets sucked in by cults. I mean, technically we were too, but we were raised in it.
Yeah.
But I think that's
why I'm never gonna talk shit, because it makes me feel awful when people are like, "Wow, you guys were so dumb that you couldn't see this."
You don't see it. That's
Bro,
the point.
That is the point.
That's the point.
That
So
is
I
the
don't
whole
want to
point.
shade her for getting sucked into it because I think Jodi was highly skilled at manipulation, and I think she knew that Ruby would kiss her feet, and she did. She did.
She played right into it. I mean, we could just see from Ruby was like a high dollar target, honestly, because not only did she knew that Ruby had money, but she also had this platform. And I don't know if it was from the early days that she was like, man, it sure would be nice to have that Instagram account be my own. But that's what it turned into. She took Ruby's Instagram account and they made it into Connections Classroom on Instagram and took all the followers with it.
And tried to do some other
300,000
stuff,
at the time, I think, when I had seen it last. So
Also, can I add another point here?
Yeah. No.
This will tie in with things that we will discuss later, but could it also be that Ruby was conventionally attractive?
To Jodi? Not to me, but
I think that isn't. I mean, I don't think Ruby is bad looking. I think she's cute. She's conventionally attractive. She's thin. She's blonde. Like, she has multiple kids, but she looks great. Like, I wonder how much that played a role. And with that, I don't think we'll ever know, but I really wonder.
this is also where Jodi's multi-million-dollar McMansion in southern Utah begins to make sense. Yes, therapists can make good money, but it seems a little wild to us that anybody was making that kind of money in Utah.
Not enough skill, in my opinion. Like, there are, like, Orna Goralnik, who's, like, an incredible couples therapist. She charges, like, upwards of $500, $600, $700 an hour.
Watch Family Therapy.
Extreme expertise in psychoanalysis and thousands of hours of training. That's one thing. If you're paying a therapist that money because they have a certain expertise that you need, that they have paid a lot of money and a lot of their effort and time to get. But Jodi just doesn't have anything like that.
She doesn't have certification.
Like, more so than the average therapist. Like,
no.
I don't, like, beyond expertise, like, years in the field, she's, like, no more qualified than I am, and I have more training than she does, like, in certain modalities and things. So, like, for her to be charging insane rates is wild.
Well, and that's why she wanted to pivot away from being therapist to being a coach, because she could do that. If you market yourself,
you can charge whatever the fuck you want.
Whatever, then, I mean, you can do that. A lot of times you won't make money, but yeah. Anyway, Shari clarifies that to become a leader in Connections, you had to pay almost $5,000 per person. And the company training that she was offering, like the one that we saw at Homey, that somebody gave us a manual from their company training, she was charging these companies $15,000. If you thumbed through that book, your jaw would be on the floor for how fucking milquetoast self-help bullshit this little binder is. And even then, it's riddled with grammatical errors and typos and just makes no sense in places. It's crazy.
That is insane to me. Insane.
Shari was a little bit hesitant at putting the label on this, but I mean, even we kind of did an analysis, but Shari believes that Connections was a cult and that her family got sucked into it. And I mean, if you haven't, I will try to put a little thing right here that takes you to the video that we kind of go through Stephen Hassan's bite model and make all of the, at the time, as accurate of
it would be worse
assessment
now.
that we could, but
It would be way worse.
It would be
now,
way worse
because we knew
now.
there was physical
Yeah.
abuse involved. Okay, so we also learned a little bit more about connection practices from some of the details that Shari talked about in the book, which includes confessing your distortions in group sessions.
Mhm.
So like their little group Zoom meetings and shit that they would have, like, was for the intent of like confessing your sins. Like, it almost just sounds like confession, which is kind of weird. I mean, Mormons kind of do that, but not with everything.
Yeah.
And they were like constantly calling
And
each
it's
other
just to your bishop.
and talking about their distorted selves, and then like obvious isolation from people who weren't buying into whatever Jodi spewed out, which also explains part of the cutoff from Ruby's family, because Shari said that none of them were buying into it at all. And then Shari said that they described cheating as noticing people who were attractive around you, or even talking to an opposite sex coworker. So like Kevin got in trouble because he talked to a female coworker, which at your job, you sometimes have to talk to people who are the opposite as you, but whatever. And then even simple things like such as seeing an attractive person online, like scrolling a magazine, like scrolling at Instagram or like looking at a magazine was
Jordan's
a porn
seen a-
addiction.
Jordan's seen the fan at Luigi.
Stop.
Jordan's got a porn addiction. Dang.
So, I mean, it affirms what we knew, right? Jodi seems sex obsessed, and we'll come back to that more a little bit later, but she's fixated on these very small details, but also like getting her, like, look at it this way, like getting her followers to tell her what they're sinning with. That's vulnerable. That's emotional vulnerability that she's cultivating with these people. They feel connected to each other, like cult tactics 101, right? And then her absolute focus on, as we've seen, repetitively removing husbands from the family. So she stated that if you were distorted, you'd be stripped of every responsibility except self-improvement. So that's how she justified these like leave of absences that these men would be invited to take from the family, was their only responsibility was self-improvement. So the only thing they could be focusing on was like analyzing their thoughts and practicing whatever the Jodi told them to do. She advocated for separations for at least 6 months. She said that was the only way to demonstrate actual change, which is crazy. And even worse, the 6-month rule also applied to children, taking privileges away for up to 6 months. I mean, this is the definition of extremism.
And isolating people. Like, your husband is struggling, and I'm going to reward him with 6 months where he's off on his own, and you get to be a single mom.
Yeah, like who does that help?
Awesome.
Who does that
sounds
help?
great.
And also,
I'm going to charge you thousands of dollars.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to charge you all that money. But also, like, as somebody who sees couples, as a couples therapist, I can say, generally speaking, it's not appropriate for a therapist to prescribe separation. Like, therapists might offer it as a suggestion if you're looking for options, but a couple is never going to come to me and I'm going to be like, 6 months separation. Like, that's not how that works. You help them come to their own decisions. You don't plant the decisions for them. Like, that's control. That's manipulation.
Yeah.
That's not how that works in any case.
She states that her mom went from eating the sausage to making it after the life coaching training for 6 weeks, which also costs $5,000, remind you. Don't forget about that bit.
Yeah.
She describes her mom hanging on to Jodi's every word like she was prophesying the second coming. And as we've said ourselves, Shari seems to see it firsthand about their parenting approaches. She says the two weren't just similar, they were symbiotic. Jodi's connection doctrine wasn't so much of a revelation to Ruby as it was a mirror, reflecting and magnifying the harsh worldview she's always had. In the end, Connections didn't change Ruby's tactics, it just gave her a manual to refine them.
Man, was I sitting there just staring at the wall for a minute after reading that, because I'm like, wow, this is like the same thing we've said. Like, it just amplified what Ruby already had going on into a more severe way, and it seems that Shari agrees.
And just tonight, we were kind of scrubbing through. We were trying to find an old clip, but we were watching some of those videos where we were reacting to clips, and some of those videos where Ruby's by herself. Oh my God, it's like you can feel Jodi just coursing through her veins.
Yes.
The way that she talks and everything, because it is fundamentally different than what we ever saw when they were doing vlogging and
Yeah.
shit like that.
Oh, yeah. So moving back to Chad a little bit, despite the fact that Chad was like being fairly successful and like doing really well in sports in high school, apparently, you know, he's still having these one-on-one sessions with Jodi at the same time, right? So apparently Jodi said that he wasn't making progress fast enough. So she suggested to Kevin and Ruby that they pull him out of all of his sports, which for things that children enjoy, that would be devastating. And given the circumstances, it certainly doesn't seem warranted and just plain cruel. And my heart breaks for Chad, especially because I feel like throughout all of this, and, you know, Shari got her own of this also, but Chad's just getting like inundated with Jodi bullshit, like constantly all the time. And I know we can see it for what it's worth as outsiders and be like, that is bullshit. But when you're indoctrinated, like you're taking all of that in, and she was not saying kind things to him. They would eventually go on to do the same thing to Shari, taking her out of track. Ruby saying at this point, at this point in the book, it seems interesting because Jodi's been involved more heavily. Ruby's taking it in wholeheartedly and like going balls to the wall with it. And then, you know, we have this very emotionally distant and kind of volatile relationship that she has with Shari because of her own shit. And then at this point, Ruby's like, you're not emotionally vulnerable with me, so I'm going to punish you. And I'm like, okay,
What?
we're going to take you out of track because you're not emotionally vulnerable with me. And obviously, everybody in the room here is sitting here going, wow, Ruby has proven time and time again that it's not safe for me to be emotionally vulnerable with you, so I'm not going to be.
Why the would she?
Because you didn't foster that environment or that safe relationship for that to happen. So why the hell would she suddenly just start doing this? Like, this is Jodi shit that Ruby's hearing, right? Yeah. So she goes on to tell Shari that she's going to be a cold, shut down wife and no man's going to want that. So again, we've returned to this weird anxiety Ruby has about her not finding a husband, or maybe that's part of it. Yeah. She's afraid she won't and she'll live with her forever. Or, I don't know what the thing is that's happening there. It's her own insecurity coming out. She describes a wall between them, which I find fascinating because she basically built it from the beginning.
Brick by brick.
Literally. And I theorize that what's potentially happening here with the Ruby-Jodi dynamic is Ruby's being love-bombed by Jodi with emotional vulnerability. Like, they're sharing deep, intimate secrets about themselves, their pain, their trauma, you know, husband shit. Kevin's terrible. My ex-husband was awful. That's why I'm divorced. My daughter doesn't talk to me. I was abandoned. Ruby's never had that before, especially from like a parental standpoint. And I'm sure Kevin isn't like the pillar of emotion. So she's eating it up because she's never gotten it before. It's like fucking water to her in the middle of a desert because she's never gotten it, especially not with this intensity. And that's why love bombing is so toxic, because it's like being hit with the fire hose of the thing that you've always wanted. Right. But I think, you know, Ruby's just sitting there lapping up validation that she never got. Jodi's sitting there, I think, playing 4D chess. Like, how do I get Shari under my control like I have Chad? Like, Chad is being obedient to some degree, despite the fact that we're still punishing him somehow. And Shari's kind of this outlier. Because in some ways, she pushes Ruby a bit. So how do I pull the thing in that's a problem to Ruby so I can make sure it's not a problem anymore and get her under my control? I'll start doing therapy or coaching or whatever the she's calling it with Shari. Ruby says, we're gifting you. Notice the verbiage. We're gifting you one-on-one sessions with Jodi.
It was just like giving the gift of forgiveness.
And she didn't want to. She didn't want to do that. But Ruby and Kevin told her, we'll take away basically everything. Your phone, your car, all your responsibilities, unless you meet with Jodi. Those are all the things that she's trying to do to keep her connected to the identity that she has outside of the abusive home that she exists in. So what choice does she really have other than to go forth with these one-on-one sessions with Jodi?
What a great gift.
Right? The fuck?
Such a good gift giver, that Ruby.
Really. No Christmas presents, and here's therapy with a non-therapist. You've been asking for therapy. Here's one with a crazy one. Shari describes a lot of the sessions with Jodi, which were quite harrowing to me as a therapist. It appears premeditated, smug, condescending, manipulative. She speaks kind of vague cognitive behavioral therapy type things, but then comes out of left field with like really deep questions that she really thinks she's doing something with. It's like, and the person on the other end of that is eating. Like, okay. And she's like, I'm eating with this. Shari's struggling with ongoing childhood abuse. Like, up to that point, she might be older. I think she was like junior, senior in high school at this point, but she's still existing in an abusive environment, right? And was showing signs of like past depression, potentially anxiety, and possibly OCD. Instead of attending to her presenting symptoms, which is what you do in therapy, taking in presentation and everything else that's existing, Jodi went into these sessions with her own agenda. Which, in my opinion, in a case like this, with Jodi's motive, is like the antithesis of being a therapist. Because Jodi went into this with control, manipulation, degradation, humiliation. How do I bring you into my corner? How do I make sure that you're not bothering Ruby? How do I make sure that you're not giving the person that I like pain and trouble, because then she's more difficult for me? Like, she went into this with her own personal agenda, right? Which is what we seek to avoid in therapy as a whole. Ethics, dual relationships, like all of those things exist to protect not only the client, but also the therapist. But that's not what she did.
Yeah.
So instead of providing Shari with evidence-based therapy for the things that she was experiencing, which would have been the ethical thing to do as a therapist, she threw gas on the flames where Shari was already struggling, which is particularly sinister, in my opinion. You don't take somebody with OCD who struggles with potentially OCD and then ask them to monitor every single thought. You don't do that, because that makes it worse. I mean, to me, it's malpractice at that point. Like, the only way that I could explain this from like my position as a therapist would be like if a doctor knew that a client had a patient had a certain diagnosis and they knew they needed this particular drug in order to get better, and then they purposefully gave them something like a different drug that was going to make them worse. Like, that's how I would explain what Jodi's doing with therapy with Shari at this point. So again, I think it's fairly sinister that Jodi decides to pick on specifically the things that Shari is struggling with, like scrupulosity, her self-esteem, like focusing on degradation to the point that it's even, Shari's thinking she's doing the right thing, and then Jodi literally tells her, she has anxiety about performing well. And Jodi misinterprets that into, really just takes it and makes it into something evil and is like, oh, you have too much self-adulation, you're conceited, you're, kind of like taking this thing that she's already struggling with and making her feel almost worse about it, and telling her, like, she literally says, quote, let's assume you're going to ace the test because you think you're so very clever. Change the language in your mind. Flip it. Think to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail this test because I'm a stupid little girl. If you ever in your life hear those words coming out of a therapist's mouth, run the other way.
Swiftness.
Like, burn it down and run away, because I can think of no circumstances where that would ever be appropriate, and how vile it is as a mental health professional to take a weakness, a vulnerability in a client where there's already a power differential and purposefully making that worse. Like, taking the things that they're struggling with and amplifying it so the symptoms increase, so they struggle more. Like, I can't think of anything worse than that as a human being or a therapist.
Right.
And it gets to the point that Shari is struggling with perfectionism. She becomes devoted to Jodi's teachings, right? She's trying to survive here. That's what this is about. And she recalls losing friendships because she was doing Jodi speak at them constantly, and people were like,
what are you
chill,
talking about?
what are you doing? And believing that all the people who didn't listen to her were going to hell anyway, so she didn't need to worry about it. Like, we see such extremes here. I think Jodi quickly saw that there is similarities in scrupulousness and perfectionism in Ruby as there is in Shari. And Shari would make somebody who would go and spread this just like Jodi would want her to. Because unfortunately, like, through no fault of her own, Jodi's skilled at manipulation, she gets sucked into this as well.
I just think of whenever you share some of your little OCD thoughts with me, and the way that like validating those thoughts would be just absolutely evil is just...
It's literally the exact opposite of anything helpful. Like, I can't even describe it.
I can't believe that Jodi was doing that.
So Shari recalls kind of a good description of what Connections is like after having a conversation where she threw up a bunch of Jodi speak onto like a friend of hers, and the friend had ended up feeling really bad about it. And I think Shari said she regretted that conversation, but she shared it with Ruby, and Ruby was like, "Oh my God, you did so great. That's amazing." And so she shares in the book, "I wasn't brave or clever. I was just riding high on my wave of self-righteous connection zeal. That's what it's like being in a cult like Connections feels like. Like you're special and no one else understands the special knowledge that you have. It's addictive. My eyes were sharp and my tongue sharper as I sought out every imperfect, distortion-filled soul that crossed my path. In my eyes, I was a crusader for truth, a warrior for enlightenment, determined to expose the flaws and weaknesses of those around me. In other words, I was a mean, judgmental scold, but I couldn't see that, and I didn't care if I lost every friend I had if it meant hearing praise fall from my mother's lips." I think that is a very powerful description of why Connections was as powerful to these women as it was.
I kind of see a lot of what it was like being a missionary in this, but this is like, I would be the first to say this is beyond the pale of what it was like to be a missionary. This is so much further beyond any of those feelings that I ever had. But you see that same kind of idea, like you are better than everybody else. You are the Lord Jesus Christ's emissary. You representative of his church. And if they are not willing to listen to what you have to say, then don't bother with them. Even
Their failure, not yours.
Dust your feet off on their doorstep as a curse to them for not being willing to accept you. So it is eerily similar in that regard. Shari recalls Ruby saying things like, "This is going to be big," regarding Connections, and droning on about how Jodi's changing lives. It appears that even at this point, Ruby seemed to revere Jodi as someone who is almost like of religious significance, like Joseph Smith. Despite the fact that Shari did observe some changes in like less yelling and she seemed calmer, she states that Ruby became more psychological in nature with punishments, starting to take an emotional approach instead of a physical one with regard to disciplining.
So apparently Ruby began using complex like object lessons that were meant to teach like a certain concept, which is kind of not uncommon in Mormonism. They use object lessons to teach a lot of things. And apparently it often led to prolonged periods of deprivation so they could truly feel the weight of their choices. Now, this already raises like 30 red flags for me as a therapist, but these punishments would soon become known to the public because of Chad and the beanbag. So like many of us assume what was happening at the time, Shari clarified that Ruby saw nothing wrong or unusual about Chad having to have his bed taken away and sleeping on a beanbag. She said that Ruby knew it made the cut in the video and didn't hesitate to post it, which we
even
long
after being warned.
Even her editor even like made it more of the focus of the video, and she was thrilled with it. So this passed two sets of eyes honestly, before it got posted. But I find that interesting because that's one of the things that we always kind of theorized about was, did she leave it on purpose? Did she leave it on purpose? Did she not, like, she doesn't really pay attention to her kids, so did it just sweep its way in there and she just hit post and whatever? Like, no. Shari clarified with 100% certainty that she posted that knowing that it was in there and wanting people to see it, and then we all know what happens next.
Yeah.
Right? The internet goes f***ing crazy.
Apparently after posting that, Kevin did suggest that they take down the video, but Ruby was determined. Jodi says that we need to stand firm in our truth. We can't let the haters win, which is like classic. We can't let the haters win. The haters are saying we're abusing our kids. We can't let them win.
But also,
crazy.
Why is like my instant thought with this was like, why is Jodi involved in this? Like, this is a decision
Absolutely
between
not.
Ruby and Kevin about content that they post on their family channel. Why is Ruby involved in this at all? But Jodi's involvement in this is interesting to me because I almost wonder if, again, if we have another 4D chess situation here where this was like, Jodi loves humiliation. So was this a humiliation thing? Or did she know that this was probably going to be the end of the family channel? If she wants Ruby to focus all her time on Connections, why wouldn't she want to contribute to the ultimate demise of 8 passengers?
Because this was a huge turning point in their channel. From then on out, posting got way less frequent. and eventually stopped altogether. And it was a huge topic of conversation on the internet after that point, because people on TikTok were talking about it, and even for years after that, people had spoken on it. So it was really a big turning point. So for it maybe to be a way that Jodi could exert more control over her, it would make a lot of sense, because like information like that going public, she had to have known that it was going to cause a stir. And then here comes Ruby into my arms to help her know.
I will come for you.
It's not you. You are living in truth.
Exactly.
And the rest of the world is living in distortion, and that's why they hate you.
So maybe it's all of the following, right? It's hard to know.
It could be any of those things.
As you might expect, Shari confirmed that there were swift consequences to posting that video, which was practically losing 90%, which was Shari's percentage point of their income. Mass unsubscribing, brands backing out, losing brand deals. People couldn't get away fast enough. But Shari said, interestingly, like while all this was happening, the blowback from this, people talking about it, Shari says that Ruby remained confident, saying this is the reason that her kids are so well behaved and people always want to know why. And if they can't handle that, then they can't handle the truth. I guess I'm not surprised by this, because it's almost like the persecution complex that we see sometimes happen with other Christian Mormon influencers, where, they get flack for something and then they're like, yes, we're doing it right because we're getting persecuted by the general public, or like whatever it is. So maybe that was part of this too. But more so, I just think it's Jodi in her ear.
Yeah.
Being like, yes, it's the right thing to do. Please do it more.
Yeah. Well, I think it mirrors what happens in Mormonism, when you levy criticism, they go, oh, well, you wouldn't be criticizing if we weren't right.
But I mean, yes. And when we talk about abuse, like financial abuse, financial exploitation can be part of it. And I almost wonder if that was part of it. Like Jodi clearly didn't have an income problem.
Yeah.
But if she takes away Ruby's income, which I mean, Kevin was making decent money as a professor at that time, so I don't know how well that would have worked anyway. But if she pulls away the thing that makes a lot of money, like what happens? She potentially becomes more reliant on Jodi.
Yeah.
It's just another reason for her to kind of run to Jodi. So maybe financial abuse was part of this plan that just enabled Ruby to become more dependent on her.
Ruby and Kevin at this time allegedly sent out cease and desist letters to content creators calling her abusive, which, anybody can draft and send a cease and desist letter. Doesn't really necessarily mean anything. I find it rather amusing that despite this fact that they even acknowledged us, and they never sent us one.
Never got anything.
So I don't know. I'm a little skeptical on that one, because I mean, it seems pretty obvious that Ruby and Jodi saw us and addressed us in a video, but they never sent us anything. But maybe at that time they'd kind of gotten over that phase or something like that.
Maybe.
It was during this period that Shari recalls CPS showing up at the house multiple times, finding nothing, and that was it. Which
tends to be the pattern that we will see with CPS going forward.
But what's happening to Ruby with all of this? We were all concerned that maybe this would vindicate her more, and it appears that, according to Shari, this is exactly what happened. She was self-righteous and a victim. Shari stated that she didn't feel she was being held accountable or needed to be. She was being crucified for her unwavering dedication to tough love.
That's a quote.
Direct quote, yeah. But while all of this was happening, Jodi, unknowingly or not, allowed Ruby a safe place to land. Don't listen to all those wrong, stupid, evil people out there on the internet. I'm with you. You're doing the right thing. I would never steer you wrong. She's offering the thing that she constantly sought, validation. And wouldn't you know it, screw 8 passengers.
Dive deeper into Connexions,
Come
baby.
right on into Connexions. Let's make you a coach. You can be right there with me. You don't need to do vlogging anymore. You can create content with me. You don't need 8 passengers. You don't need the
well, and I
rest of the
think
internet.
she understood that Ruby does really well, like with a project. Like she took 8 passengers from a teeny tiny vlog that nobody watched to one of the biggest family vlogging YouTube channels out there. And so I think,
By far.
again, if this is Jodi being wicked but smart, I don't know. But to think like, hey, if we take A passengers away, I'm introducing you a new project that you can pour all your time, money, and energy into.
Yeah.
And it'll still give you that feeling of doing something, but this time you'll be doing something very important. And like that to me is also like, damn, if she knew what she was doing, this is crazy. Like this is sophisticated manipulation at its core to a level like I have never seen. Like this is wild if she really knew what she was doing every step of the way here.
And I think I would go as far as to say that Jodi was so lost in the sauce, her own sauce at that she probably thought that Connexions would make it to the level that A Passengers was.
Yep.
If she had Ruby on board. What she didn't realize was that is completely not the allure of the channel.
No.
The channel is not successful because of Ruby.
It's the kids.
It's the kids. It's the family experience. It's the whole thing, the whole having a bunch of kids and everything like that. And I feel like Jodi was really just too lost in the sauce because Ruby is forgettable at best. Let's be real. She's uninteresting. She doesn't like her kids, and it was pretty obvious on camera and a lot of times. Yeah, I don't know what she saw there, but
I think that's a good point, though, because I think that's where we see, often with things like narcissism, we see kind of a false reality or a false narrative or entitlement that exists where she is so self-deluded that she thinks that all she needed was the platform and she could take it all the way.
Yeah.
Like she thinks that she just needed what Ruby could offer and then she would be as successful. But it's like, that's how self-deluded that she is. And that it was extremely triggering for her when things didn't go as well. Like when she didn't get all those reviews and had that total crash out.
Oh, right.
We need your help. We have almost 9,000 people on Moms of Truth in almost 4 months. It's unbelievable. When people show up and they're aggressive, wanting to attack, we invite them off. We invite them to see truth. They don't want to see truth. We invite them off. Those people, because they get so mad that they can't control what's going on, they turn right around and go give us a 1-star review. Because we've been trying to make it really easy for you to give us a 5-star review. We've put the link on the bottom of every single post. So all you have to do is click the link and give us a 5-star review. That's as simple as it is. But you guys aren't doing it. I think we've had 5 people from the last time I asked, which was probably a month ago. 5 out of almost 9,000. 5 people. Now, do I care about what Google says about me? I don't care at all. However, people who are coming, they care. So I'm asking you, please, 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 to help your other brothers and sisters know that this is a safe, principled, honest, responsible, and humble platform. Please, will you please take 5 minutes and go give us a 5-star? This is something super simple we're asking you to do, and you're not doing it. It's confusing to me. It's like you guys like what you're getting from us, and we're saying, hey, can you please help? It's like we're going across the plains, pushing a wagon cart, and you like you're going across the plains, but you're in the wagon. It's like, can you get out and please walk a little bit? Can you push a little bit? Like, we're not even asking you to do that. We're just saying, can you please take 5 minutes and hit a button and go give us a 5-star review? Please, please. I don't know how else to say it to you. Please, please. We need your help. If you're going to be part of this Connexions truthful family, you've got to do your part.
That's a perfect example of like, I'm entitled, I'm special, you don't see it, and therefore you're a dumbass. Like that, it's never me. It never comes back to me and what I'm doing. It's always you, your fault, your problem, that things aren't working out the way that I wanted them to. Again, I could not talk about this book without talking about the things that Shari and Jodi talked about in session, because again, these were things that we didn't know. We didn't know if Jodi ever saw Shari one-on-one. Like that was not information that we had. And now that we do have it, the things that Jodi told her and the things that happened in those sessions are kind of mind-blowing to me. The things in here are crazy. But I wanted to talk about one thing in particular. Like Jodi is particularly like abusive towards her in therapy sessions, to the point that like Shari will do everything that she wants and Jodi will respond by saying, "You're not getting it. This is about more than tallying thoughts like an obedient little drone." That's a literal quote. That's a literal quote. Again, if your therapist ever says anything like this to you, run the other way and report them to the board. But she says all this, right? Like she says all these horrible things to Shari. Obedient little drone. She calls her unempathetic. She says she's not getting it. She says all these things, right? Shari walks away from this session like pretty distraught. Like it's like Ruby 2.0. She can never do anything right. She can never give her what she wants because Jodi doesn't know what she wants, right? She's making shit up on the fly and she's trying to satisfy her own shit and it's not working. So then she comes back to therapy next time with her or coaching or whatever the she was calling it at the time. And she said, like, Shari, being amazing as she was, talked about, like, brought to therapy, like, hey, I wanted to talk about last time you said some things, like the little drone things that, like, actually really hurt my feelings. And I wanted to talk about that. And she used, like, Jodi's own language, like truth, and having truth is, like, a way to introduce it, right? So she's, like, speaking her own language. And then Jodi responds, I never said those things, Shari. This is where I was ready to throw the fucking book. This is when I was ready to throw the fucking book. Because my anger, my rage, my frustration for Shari is just, like, so extreme at this point. Because, like, she literally wrote it. Like, she wrote the things that Jodi told her in her journal. So then she's in that session literally being gaslit by her own therapist saying that she didn't say those things. She said, that's not how I talk. You must have misinterpreted my meaning and then remembered it as fact. You see how convenient that statement is? You could use that for just about anything.
I reject your reality and substitute my own.
Literally insane. Like, I can't tell you how damaging this would be to a person to be gaslit like that. Like, especially to someone who's been actively abused.
Your coach.
Like, this is crazy. This is absolutely fucking crazy. And she knows that she said that. That's what, like, underlying this is just evil, is that she fucking knows. She took it too far and she doesn't want to take accountability for it. But this, for Shari, was the, like, final straw. It kind of illuminated for her what was happening and started to realize what Jodi was doing and began to distance herself from her, which I think is really incredible for her to even come to that conclusion given everything that she's experienced up to this point. But I just can't imagine a therapist behaving this way. Like, it bewilders me that she's not a therapist. No, she's not. She's a fucking monster.
But she is pretending like she's a therapist in the way that she's operating, which is crazy. She
talks about one of the final things that kind of cracked the facade of what Jodi was doing is she said that babies are distorted. And if you remember to what we talked about at the very beginning of this book in that first video where Ruby said that babies are inherently manipulative and can't be coddled or whatever, you see, like, cooperating, compatible ideology happening here. And she said, according to Jodi, they're manipulators who feel entitled for their mothers to come and tend to their every whim. I don't understand this. I truly don't understand this. Like, the way that Jodi describes babies is the most insane thing I've ever heard. Let me read it to you because I couldn't describe this if I wanted to. A baby cries because it's entitled and it knows someone will come running because it believes that the world revolves around them and their needs. Unless you train it to not be entitled, you're just reinforcing that behavior in them. It's our job as women and mothers to break that cycle of manipulation, to teach children from an early age that they need to earn their blessings. Only then can we hope to create a society free from distortion. What the fuck? What the fuck? Like, one, this just removes humanity from children, in my opinion.
They're just robots.
Is straw number one. But straw number two, the fact that she says it, like, she has removed all humanity from children. And this is, at its core, ironically, from a therapist, pathologizing babies. Babies aren't capable of being selfish. Babies are only capable of one thing, and generally it's making noise to get their needs met. That's all they know. They have one tool at their disposal, and it's crying.
It's just survival instinct.
That's all it is. This is literally developmental.
This is Jodi being so lost in her own sauce that she's like, literally everything I do is to manipulate. And that's what a baby does. Mm-hmm. It's manipulating people to get its needs met, which is exactly what I do. So I
But
guess
think
babies
about-
are master manipulators.
But think about back to that first video where we talked about the schemas that develop from childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is a schema that she had largely probably because of how her parents treated her. And it's that same way. Babies are manipulative. Babies, like, are entitled. Babies are, this, like, whole verbiage is like children are bad.
Yeah.
Children lack humanity. Children have to be shaped and molded into what you need them to be instead of being enough as they are. I think this says a lot, and I think this contributes to how Jodi would eventually treat Ruby's children, and probably how she treated her own, as she views children as being inherently selfish, which, not to mention, is sometimes developmentally appropriate. It's literally a developmental phase for a lot of children. But she's also taught, like Shari says in the book, that she was taught by her parents that people weren't to be trusted. And then she allegedly had experiences in her own childhood where she was sexually abused by teens, children. So her schema becomes the world is unsafe, people are unsafe, children are unsafe. And a way to deal with that would be maybe to distance yourself and avoid those things. Or it might be to help them in your twisted way.
Yeah.
And if they refuse your help, because that means
them.
they're distorted, then it's okay to punish them.
Yeah.
So basically, we're just okay with punishing children.
But even then, it's not punishing them. It's just straight up abusing them.
It's literally.
And breaking them like a horse.
And she has like this perfect logic in her mind for the reason for that, because she can't, essentially, she'll never see anything wrong with what she's doing because she feels like she is righteous in her choice to do these things to children because she has to break them of these things.
At some point or another, apparently Jodi started to become insecure about her position as the head of Connexions.
Paranoia.
And made her workers sign a contract that no one could use her materials or teachings unless they paid her a cut of their earnings. It's starting to sound like a billion-year contract.
This is insane.
A really wild choice, but apparently it was the final straw for many people who chose to walk away. Jodi would apparently go on to lie and say they were in distortion, of course, because they're walking away from Jodi. She is truth. She's the truth. And it seems that Jodi's paranoia was seeping through and she needed more control for more power, more money,
greed.
more greed. Yeah. But seriously, it is funny that that's what broke the spell on people. They're like,
What the fuck?
You want a cut of your intellectual property? That's crazy. I'm
That's
done.
insane. That'd be like, I use like 3 different modalities in a session, and that'd be like, I have to pay the founders of those modalities a certain percentage based on how much I used it with. Like, that's insane.
So a little bit of shame on those people for that being
Really.
Once she was like, yeah, babies are manipulators. And you were like,
You were still hanging on at that
I'm
point?
cool with that. But as soon as you're
no.
asking for a cut, yeah, that.
At the time of Shari getting ready to start college, gain some independence. We love that for her.
I love that.
The frequently talked about Jodi's episodes began that we got after
Lord.
the information we got after the arrest, mainly from Kevin, right? So describing to Shari on the phone, she calls Shari up, getting ready to go for college. Her house is not her priority. She's trying to get her shit in order so she can move into her dorm, like, let her live. Ruby calls her up and says, Jodi is being bombarded, quote, bombarded by the adversary, soul under siege by Satan himself and silencing her truth, unquote. So she was moving in. Jodi was apparently experiencing, according to Shari, nightmares, visions, anxiety, and being targeted by demons. Shari described them as mysterious trances, not quite seizures, not quite sleep, but something eerily in between. And then Ruby and Kevin were like running interference on these and conducting what they called spiritual interventions. But that still wasn't enough for Jodi. So she's suffering alone at night with these demonic interruptions. It would be wrong for her to be alone, right? So what an interesting idea to bring Ruby into bed with her at night to help stop these alleged demonic issues, we'll say.
Awesome.
Interesting.
I also want to bring up here that it is really weird that Ruby and Kevin would kind of begin to take kind of dominion over something that seemed to be demonic possession.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of time, anytime I've ever heard about that, people are not going it alone. They're usually contacting their bishop
Yeah.
for something like that, because
Yeah.
the bishops are supposed to have dominion over those types of things. Like you would call them to bless your home because you think there's a demonic presence or something like that.
Well, wasn't
Usually
there
it would
something
not
about
just
that
be
though?
a friend.
Didn't the other people, like the pages that she was staying with, try to help her and take her to the bishop, and the bishop was like, you need mental health help?
I think so. I can't remember.
Like, this is
There was so
beyond our
much-
pay grade, girl.
Yeah. And, you know, I don't blame them at the same time, but it is really wild that they would just forego church involvement altogether, and they were just in the
not
trenches by themselves.
A common thing, really.
No.
A lot of, like, there are a lot of Mormons who I think believe in, like, Satan being a real entity and demons and things, but I've also come across a lot of Mormons who don't believe in those things.
Yeah.
There's not a whole lot of, like, definitive Mormon answers around like demonic stuff, in my opinion. Like there's even like debate around exorcisms and shit.
Yeah, it's mostly the only things I've ever really heard are stories from a friend of a friend,
A family member of mine.
a family member.
Yeah.
It's all kind of just, you know, people have experiences that are inexplicable, and if I'm not there, I'm not going to try to explain them, but you know.
Yeah.
Things like that happen all the time. Anyway, to get on with that whole situation, not only was Jodi moving in, she was also going to be moving into Shari's room now that there was a vacancy in the house.
Which explains a lot because she filmed a lot. Like,
Yeah.
Ruby filmed a lot of videos in Shari's room because she had that geometric wall that she painted that I thought we always thought it was interesting that she was filming in Shari's room. But now we know that they basically took over that whole space as
That
their
was
like
kind of
little
their enclave.
Yeah, their little special place.
Shari describes seeing Jodi come into their home that day after she cleaned out her room looking like a, quote, Old Testament hermit who'd been wandering in the desert wastes, which really paints quite the picture of someone who's constantly looking disheveled. But
I think it's so funny. Like, I love that she injected that here because it really gives us a picture for what's
Yeah.
going on. But, like, from a therapeutic, like a mental health perspective, I have a lot of wonderings about what's happening here. Like, we have a few options theoretically, right? Like, we have possible hallucinations that come from some mental health issues. Could be an episode of psychosis, could be mental health issues, something more serious, or even sometimes hallucinations are caused even by lack of sleep.
yeah.
And so there could be even something kind of more mundane that could be causing these things. But I also sometimes wonder if that wasn't even a thing at all. And Jodi was basically just coming up with kind of an elaborate ruse to infiltrate
Honestly,
Ruby's home
That has always
and
been
life.
That's always been my thought behind all of this is like there's so much manipulation. There's so much just wild shit floating around in her head.
Mm-hmm.
Is it so far-fetched that she's just faking a whole bunch of shit so that she can
Not at all.
weasel her way further in?
The wild thing is there's potential that even if she is making it up, she might also believe it.
Yeah. She's told herself the lie
Like
long
she's
enough.
bought into the delusion. So Shari called this an occupation, which based on the events that happened later, I completely agree
Honestly.
with. But I think the latter is more likely. I think that whether she might have bought into these things, but I think she knew that this was another step to kind of root herself more deeply into Ruby's life. And then, you know, the next step of the plan, right, that she does in these situations is pushing the men out. So what better way to directly push Kevin out than being there? Less worry.
In the home.
Yeah, in the house. Less worry about Kevin getting to her because she's in the house all the time. And then potentially another motive that we all kind of vaguely speculated about.
So as things came out after the arrests would corroborate, Jodi seemed to be recording a bunch of these spectacular visions in a leather binder that she called the pen papers, which sounds
I would love to read.
so much cooler than it probably actually is. But Kevin did reveal in a police interview that he also knew of the pen papers, and here in the book, Shari is also sharing these. And apparently these visions consisted of Ruby walking on water with Jesus and riding on a
And then
lion.
Jodi riding on the line.
Oh, Jodi
Yes.
was riding on a lion named Charles through the gates of heaven. Jodi believed these pen papers would one day be scriptures validated by God himself. And to
Oh,
that,
this is where the delusion is strong.
Charles?
Charles?
God is showing you fantastical visions, and the name of the line is Charles.
Somebody has it as their
Like-
little Reddit label in the
Oh
A
my
passenger
God.
stuff, and it makes me
Their
laugh
little
every time
flair.
I see it. Like it's wild. It's wild. But think about Ruby buying into this shit though, because she's like, "Oh, I'm walking on water with Jesus. That means I'm doing the right
I know.
thing."
Jodi
you
was
know?
like, I have to, it's gonna sound fantastical, so I'll distract Ruby by saying, you were there too. You were walking on water.
with Jesus.
And I was writing a lion named Charles. But you were there. You were walking with Jesus on water.
You
It's
know,
crazy.
you were. Sherry mentions feelings about Kevin throughout the book, and I know we all have a lot of feelings about Kevin, but at this point, especially when Jodi moved in, she said, I quote, "I yearned for my dad to find his backbone to step up and be the protector he was supposed to be. In the end, he never even tried." And my heart breaks for her because she's desperate for her father in this moment. And I also think, she illustrates some parts in this book where, Kevin tried. He did try to stand up for her in some places, right? Like, stepping up for her with therapy, and he seemed to kind of doubt some of the things that Ruby was doing. It seemed like maybe he didn't agree, but she steamrolled him, or like, he snuck her ice cream under the dinner table one night after Ruby punished her for not eating anything. Like, it seemed like he kind of always had her back. She described herself earlier in the book as a daddy's girl, so this was kind of breaking my heart a little bit for her to be feeling this way, because I imagine she felt really alone at this point. So we'll get back to Kevin, but I wanted to illustrate her thoughts on him, at least at this point.
Jodi takes over Sherry's room and sets up shop from there. She also says that her and Ruby had little excursions regularly to Dairy Queen.
Like every night.
Enough that she called it a cardiologist's nightmare. Like, there must have been excessive consumption of Dairy Queen ice cream, which I just want to add, Dairy Queen's kind of mid.
It is kind of mid. Of all the places.
The ice cream is kind of mid.
Like, not
the
a
flavors
swig?
and everything is, yeah.
Not a soda shop in here. I'm kind
Seriously.
of disappointed. Not very Mormon of you.
Little disappointed.
And then we have Pam.
Yeah, Pam would come along here as well, joining them upstairs in Sherry's room, doing the devil knows what. They would also go on girls' trips, including down to Mexico, where they would stock up on antibiotics in case of the end of days.
That's
which
wild.
is wild.
Like, Sherry recalls them coming home with like bags of pills and like not fun stuff, antibiotics, because
right.
there's a lot of Mormons who will go down to Mexico and buy antibiotics for second coming prepper shit.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a little weird.
Sherry also confirms that, like we
theorized,
they were all obsessed with the book Visions of Glory,
which we have a whole series on.
Interestingly, Sherry states that she feels like she never saw Ruby happier than when she was living, or when Jodi was living with them.
I think that is a very interesting point.
Interesting.
A very interesting point. So here we know Kevin's actively being pushed out. And, Redditors wouldn't come to this knowledge until a while later, but these are the events that essentially led up to, that post that sent the internet ablaze in the 8-passenger sub, which was Kevin moved out and Jodi moved in, right? So Kevin's not even allowed to go upstairs. Couldn't even go in the kitchen. Jodi has all these rules for him about what he's allowed to do in his own house. And then in a not so shocking turn of events, Ruby apparently also tried to turn over control of the 8-passengers YouTube channel to Jodi. And her manager at the time was like, I don't think that's a good idea. I wouldn't do that if I were you. And she was like, oh, it's all for God. It's all God's purpose. Or, whatever the hell she says, right?
Donald.
I don't know what that was, but she also became super secretive about Jodi being there. Like, Sherry states that she essentially put the whole house under a gag order, that Jodi's presence could not be revealed to anyone. And Ruby was paranoid about people hearing Jodi in Sherry's content that she would like record. She would like have to listen to it and make sure that you couldn't hear Jodi. And they even pretended to film Connexions things in separate rooms of the house because they didn't want people to know that they were living in the same house, like to keep up the lie. Mm-hmm. Like, why so elaborate? I don't know. Was she worried about the repercussions as a professional? Was she worried about people at Connexions finding out? Like, it's interesting to me that they wanted to keep it so under wraps.
We are officially to the point that a lot of people are probably waiting for. and that the internet has long speculated about. While staying at the house before she left for college, she needed something for her room. So Shari goes in there to the place that is rightfully hers, right? And she is met with the following scene.
As a queer individual, I want to be mindful of how we handle this discussion, because we have always approached this on our channel with like, let's not speculate about sexuality, but we can say that there's weirdness. Like there's weirdness. It does, like, Jodi comes off as just a queer person to me, as a person who is also queer and kind of picks up on the vibes. Jodi comes off that way to me, and she always has. But we know the dangers of speculating about people's sexuality online and how that can backfire and cause additional pain for the person involved. So we've always tried to take an approach that has kind of respected potentially whatever that is. But it is, you know, it's dangerous, right? Because we have these two women who are very vocally against queer people, very homophobic, very transphobic, very explicit about how they feel about being gay, people being gay, lesbians, like, you know, the whole thing. But I don't want this to become the point that gets so sensationalized out of all of this, because if I was Shari, or if I was one of these kids, and the only thing that people talked about in this whole mess was the fact that Jodi and Ruby are apparently lesbians, that's total speculation, that would bother me.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like it's a Daily Mail spin on something that is so much more incredibly deeper and harmful from that. And if the only thing that you walk away from this is like that you're amused that the two of them potentially had a queer relationship, like, I have a problem with that. I really do. Like, and especially if we're going to get to the point where, you know, people are always like, oh, it's the people who are most homophobic that are queer, that are actually queer, and they're just hiding it and they're closeted. Like, that's toxic rhetoric. And I hate that this is something that, again, might support that narrative, but that's not always the case. And speculating on sexuality in that way isn't great. And I also think it takes away, like, from some of the seriousness of it, because the fact are these, like, regardless of whether or not they're queer, like, these women are horrible child abusers. Like, that's the point. And so for people who, like, run with this and think it's, like, funny and silly, like, on one hand, I think it can be amusing in the sense that we all kind of sense that something was potentially off here. But I think for that to be your only takeaway, like, that's, you know, like, let's not do that. Like, let's not deduce this whole very complicated abusive story down to, like, funniness because they're actually queer. I pushed open the door to my bedroom and looked around, confused. The room was bathed in the soft glow of candles. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender and vanilla wafting from the massage oils on the dresser. I quickly grabbed what I needed and got the hell out of there, feeling like I had just walked into someone else's honeymoon suite. The only thing missing was rose petals on the bed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Maybe it was just the fact that the couch was hurting my back, or maybe it was the sense that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. I tossed and turned, thoughts swirling. It must have been around 5 a.m. when I heard a creak of footsteps upstairs. I cracked one eye open just in time to see Ruby tiptoeing out of my room, her hair messy, her cheeks flushed, and her robe hastily tied, heading back to the bedroom she shared with my dad. A strange smile on her face. She looked mischievous. What the hell was going on? Why was Ruby sneaking around in the middle of the night like a teenager trying not to get caught by her parents? Were they really doing candlelit massages in my bedroom? How could this be happening with all of this in the house? It was equal parts fascinating and horrific. Two women who preached truth while living lies, who condemned queerness very publicly in their Connexions videos while embodying it privately, in my room, on my bed most likely.
Now that was a bombshell, because this was, a lot of people had been speculating on it. It had crossed our minds, and we did not want to make assumptions because they're harmful, especially in the greater scope of the culture war that is currently being waged by the American right wing against queer folks in today's day and age. We don't need people who are abusing children being associated with the rest of the LGBTQIA plus community, because that is the exact thing that they are trying to paint as. And I also want to mention that this, essentially, the sneaking around, the infidelity, and all of that is the direct product of the rhetoric that the Mormon Church uses regarding queer folks.
Mm-hmm.
It is 100% that, because if neither of them had grown up in that context, the outcomes would
Probably
almost
be different.
certainly would have been different. So when we talk about these things, and the reason why a lot of you were there, the reason why we were so staunch that we are not to be...
We can see patterns, but we're not
We can see
placing
patterns,
labels.
not placing labels. We're not speculating on their sexuality, is solely for that purpose. It's to not be furthering that kind of discussion regarding dangerous people and queer people, because there are dangerous people who happen to be queer and they don't necessarily correlate. Actually, let me revise that. They do not correlate. You can be both of those things and there's no connection between the two.
Shari even speculated in this on, her own perspective on this and said, the Mormon Church isn't necessarily leading the Pride Parade, but she said that she and others have different perspectives on queer people, which was encouraging to hear from her. She sounds progressive-y Mormon in my mind in some ways. But she talked about, she wondered about what it would have been like if that was actually the case, if both of them were actually queer, and if they could have just lived their lives out that way. And it would have been a shock for her, and it probably would have still been hurtful and things, but how much better would that have been than all of this nonsense? And how much of this is forced repression that these women might feel of their identity, of parts of themselves, of their attraction towards other individuals? Does that come out in their hate for others because of these repressed things that they've had to keep within because the Mormon Church has told them that it's sinful and it's horrible? And, that eats away at you. It eats away at you. And as much as I detest these two women, it also is, I think, tragic. I think it can also be tragic at the same time that these women potentially, if they were queer, doesn't even have to be full these women could be bisexual. People are making leaps and saying they're lesbians. We don't know that. So, bisexual erasure, but that's a topic for a different day. But I think it breaks my heart in that sense that they potentially had to deal with the pain of repressing an important part of their identity because the Mormon Church told them that it was inherently sinful to be that way. And I think my detest for them and my acknowledgement of that can coexist, even though they might seem to cancel each other out. They don't.
So to my progressive Mormons out there, or really to anyone who belongs to a similar organization that professes love but fosters an environment where people have to express their love in secret and they have to lie and cheat in order to do that, to reevaluate your support of that organization. Because ultimately, unless you can give me some other proof otherwise, it was the Mormon Church that fostered an environment where both of them felt that this was necessary.
And just to be super clear, there is another passage in the book where Shari talks about how after the arrest, after all of it happened, she was able to log into Ruby's computer, access her iCloud account, and she was able to read some text messages or emails or notes and things between Ruby and Jodi that did confirm that there was a physical aspect to their relationship. And Ruby had complained that it was often physical only for Jodi, and she wasn't getting anything in return. She made a funny comment about her mom servicing someone and how there's a first time for everything. So I think she had a sense of humor about it, but that's the other kind of confirmation that people had from this, was there was a physical element to their relationship. And she brought up massages, and I honestly wonder if that's where it originated. Massages could have been an entry point to this, because a lot of people, religious aspects of touch for some people. And so maybe that's part of how Jodi was able to integrate this in a way where they felt they could still be homophobic, but they weren't, they were special. They weren't doing anything wrong because it was being condoned by God. There would have been a lot of mental gymnastics happening for that. I would be very interested to see what those were, but I don't know that we ever will.
But I mean, you see it in a lot of other high demand religions or cults or really small splinter groups. You see it in the temples with Warren Jeffs, where he was essentially abusing these children that were his child brides in the name of, see, this is what God wants or whatever. And there are a billion other stories of even non-Mormon related things of sexual touch and everything being related to spirituality. And
Just highlights the culty aspect really strongly.
Shari is long fed up and probably emotionally exhausted at this point. I
mean, Jodi's in her room.
Seriously. And after that situation, I don't think there's any coming back. Like,
she has to sleep on the couch when she comes home.
Yeah. Shout out to Shari for being able to continue
Honestly.
on after that. Because, I mean, that's a lot to handle. Like, not only is your mom doing things that seem like she shouldn't when she's married to somebody else, but also hating on queer folks when she seems to be doing stuff like that.
So confusing.
Yeah, it would be extremely confusing. I mean, she's still young at this point. Like, a freshman in college is still young. It's basically an old high schooler. When recalling one of these instances, she shared a conversation in which ended in Ruby upset and completely out of turn, saying, "I can't take this abuse," she wailed, and ran out the door with her emotional support demon, Jodi.
That's my add-in, not Shari's.
Her emotional support demon.
So she's like
on the nose.
They bail, like they were late to a dinner that they planned. Like she was like, "We want to take you out to dinner." And Shari was like, "Okay." And then they were like 2 hours late, holed up in their room doing God knows what. And Shari was like, "I'm just going to make myself fucking dinner because you guys clearly aren't coming down. What's the point?" And then they come down at like 8 o'clock and they're like, "Okay, you ready to go to dinner now?" And she's like, "I ate like 2 hours ago, but okay." And then, you know, Ruby's like upset and, you know, it turns into a whole thing. And I don't think Shari said anything out of turn or anything that I thought was inappropriate. And then Ruby's like, "I can't take this abuse." Like, it reminds me of my mom, honestly. This is something that my mom would do. But then she runs out. Jodi's following her. She's crying. It's a whole thing. But I found this interesting because I think this demonstrates a really solid tactic that a lot of people use in these situations, which people have developed an acronym for called DARVO, which is deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. And that is, I think, Jodi and Ruby's MO in all of this is like, I'm going to deny. None of it's my fault. I'm going to attack you instead. And you're the one who hurt me. And they become really proficient in that. And you feel kind of crazy because you're like, I was the one who brought up a problem. How did we end up with me being the one in trouble again? And then, you know, Ruby's crying and Jodi's like validating her and taking care of her, you know. But the whole thing that stood out to me about that was that, you know, maybe they went to Dairy Queen. I don't know where they went at that point. But they come back from the house and they come in the door and Shari hears them and they're both sobbing like uncontrollably. Like they're wailing, both of them, when they come in the door. And she's like, "Are you good?"
What's going on here?
And so let me read you what Jodi said because I find this very illuminating, knowing everything that we know. Jodi looked up at me with tearful, bloodshot eyes, whimpering. "Your fight with your mother. It reminded me of my daughter. She left me. There's no greater pain than being abandoned, Shari. You can't do that to Ruby. She loves you more than anything in the whole world. My daughter left me. There's no greater pain in being abandoned."
So this takes a very strong soul because most of us are not even willing to consider not having our children in our lives. And I hope that you'll reconsider. Because there are people in your lives.
Mormon Church, excommunicate this bitch. Do you hear what she's fucking advocating for?
Oh my
Both of these.
God.
How are these people still on your rolls?
They said the quiet part out loud.
Holy shit, dude.
Like, there's some mental health theories that I have just off that conversation alone, but I think that stands out quite a bit because Jodi is very hard on the surface. Like, she comes across non-empathetic, non-compassionate, just like a total, I don't even know how to describe her. Like, she just comes off very off. And then touching on something like this, those wounds come to the surface and you see almost like impulsivity and extreme volatile emotion from her. Like, on the surface, she's this hard ass kind of woman, but beneath the surface, she's struggling with the pain of being allegedly abandoned by her own daughter. And instead of coping with her pain, instead of dealing with that in a healthy way, she's
weaponizing it.
She's weaponizing it and then forms a codependent relationship with a mommy vlogger and tries to ruin her family so she's as destitute and lonely as she is. So like similar to Ruby's own endless hamster wheel of trying to get validation from people, Jodi does the same thing, but just in a different way, which is why I think the two of them end up being so compatible, because they're both kind of seeking the same thing and not getting it. They're both trying to use like fame and elitism and those kinds of concepts of like, I'm better than you, as a way of coping with their pain.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Well, here's one for Mormonism. We'll throw them a bone.
This is rare.
We're constantly just shitting on them. Shari's bishop actually offered to pay for her therapy because Ruby wouldn't. And we have seen a lot on the internet. A lot of people share their experiences, and a lot of shitty bishops are out there. But this was definitely very encouraging to see, because
I hand it to him for that.
yeah, and it doesn't happen all the time. It depends on your bishop.
It really does.
But it sounded like, did she say that I guess she wouldn't specify if she had seen an LDS Family Services
No, she
therapist.
didn't. I wouldn't be surprised, but maybe not.
Yeah. Anyway, but it is interesting to see.
So Shari also validated something that I think a lot of us also speculated, which is that Jodi appeared like sex obsessed. Like it came up a lot in the parenting stuff. It came up a lot in Connexions videos. Like it was just something that she kind of brought up very frequently.
Very Robert California.
Like everything is sex apparently, and her fixation on porn addictions and gay people and, you know, all the things, right? But Shari had an interesting theory, I think, which I don't think is far off. She said, a part of me pitied her, a repressed, self-loathing, deeply damaged woman trapped in an environment in which she felt compelled to conceal her true nature. Surrounded by women she couldn't have, women who were married to men she resented. In her mind, there was only one path to justice: crush the sperm donors and liberate the females. I think it's a very blunt way of saying it, but I think it is an interesting perspective, right? Like, especially if Jodi is actually queer along that spectrum anywhere, and Mormonism has told her that she can't be with any of these women, you know, she's just externalizing that by punishing men, thinking men are the problem, when in reality, like, it's, you know, we all know it's the religion that's the issue, right? But she's not going to make that leap. So
yeah,
she's going to do the next best thing, which is punish the men who aren't showing up in the way that they should be because they're looking at women at the grocery store or seeing an ad for a woman on Instagram and suddenly they're porn addicted, distorted humans.
I mean, from other things that we've seen, it does definitely play into the way that she operates. So it would make sense. And at this point, she's gunning for Kevin pretty hard. I mean, she's living in their house. She's inviting Jodi into her makeshift room regularly. Kevin's not allowed to be in certain areas of the house. I don't know what else the situation would be. I mean, she has to be living there. And the two of them already do have an interesting relationship where it seems like Jodi gets in between Ruby and Kevin. So much so, possibly, that Kevin moved out. He was noticing women at the gym and she would shame him for it.
Because he looked at them. Not even talked to them, just looked.
And apparently she was so deep into his brain, too, that he would confess that sort of thing, which is
crazy.
Awful.
But makes sense.
Apparently she even accused him of being perverse when hugging his own daughters.
Which is apparently something that she's done to other people as well.
Yeah.
Shari called this the nuclear option, like Jodi's nuclear option when involved with families, because it would be the thing that would ultimately push people over the edge if those accusations were made.
Well, and especially with the wife, because can you imagine? You're like, I'm noticing that you're doing some perverse thing with your own daughters, like activating that idea of not my daughters. Even my husband could do that. You're gone.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's like a path right out.
So shortly after she noticed these things going on, Kevin called Shari to let her know that Ruby had, quote unquote, invited him to leave so that he could work on himself for at least a year. Now, remember, before we had talked about the 6-month rule usually being what worked for most people to work on themselves.
Apparently, Kevin needed a year.
A whole year. Shari was, of course, devastated by this. He said that he would be taking Chad with them and wouldn't be talking to any of the other children, and then eventually not to Shari either. And Chad was also having to work on himself as well, so he needed to be cast away.
And then they eventually went back on that. he and Chad eventually separated. Something that was chilling for me about this part of the book was Shari theorized that maybe Jodi and Ruby did all of this to Kevin to really push him to the edge, like to the point that he would disappear forever. And I think that is tragic that she had to think that about her own father, that her mother would be willing to pair up with someone and do something so severe. But I don't necessarily think that Shari was all far off for thinking that. Because
look where we ended up.
what else really could Jodi and Ruby do to knock him down more? Like, I'm not really sure what else they could have done. Like, I feel like they ripped that man to shreds. Like, you have to remember, like, as much Kevin can be a perpetrator of some of these issues and also a victim, right? Like, he can exist as both of those things at the same time. And holding him accountable for those things is a separate issue. I think we can take a nuanced view of this and look at the fact that Kevin was being probably actively abused by Jodi and Ruby.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a leap to say that, you know, Shari didn't really talk about this, but I don't think it would be much of a leap to assume that Ruby was toxic and potentially abusive to Kevin, at least emotionally. I don't think that's far out of the realm, and I think they've talked about how they're excited about this new documentary that's coming out because Kevin finally gets to share his side of the story. And, you know, we don't talk about men who experience domestic violence as often because it doesn't happen as often, and I think there's a lot of shame and stigma around it. But I think Kevin's story here is important because as much as I think he made some errors, I think he did, I think Ruby has kind of been almost grooming him and potentially abusing him from the very beginning, and that's a long time. And if you get constantly beaten down like that, like you're constantly beaten down, you have no self-esteem, you feel like you can't defend yourself, constantly enduring psychological abuse, you're not going to have somebody who's going to be able to stand up for his kids who's beaten down like that. You know, like it's just not realistic. So I think having a nuanced view of Kevin here is important, and it's tragic to me to think that they were potentially pushing him to that point so that they wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. That's a horrible, horrible, horrible thing.
I feel like we all kind of think that we are built different and that these people were just...
that we would act different in these situations.
Couldn't do it. But it's important to realize that Jodi was like a serial life ruiner.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin was not the only one who had his life and marriage absolutely destroyed by Jodi. There were a whole bunch of other men and other people who had their lives destroyed by Jodi. So
like he was involved with her. Like he did sessions with her where he was confessing to being a porn addict and things, which was probably... I mean, that's all manipulation. That's all coercion to get him to be emotionally vulnerable with her so she could beat him down more for his vulnerabilities.
In that aspect, take a step back.
Yeah.
I know I've always been like
we're critical of
Kevin hater, and it's important to realize that this woman was a fucking professional at ruining people's lives, and that is evidenced by all the people who had their lives ruined by her. And it's not just Kevin, it's not just Adam Paul Steed and other people.
Like, if she was convincing him that he was having perverse thoughts about his kids, it is quite possible that he fully believed that, and he thought that the best thing he could do for his kids at that point was to get away.
Yeah.
If he, like, it is certainly possible that he fully believed those things, and that is just how disgusting and insidious and vile Jodi is as a human being, that she would be willing to plant something like that into a person that she's been repeatedly beating down and exploiting their vulnerabilities to do that. I think we can be hard on Kevin in some areas while also pulling back and acknowledging the nuance in some others.
Toward the end of the book, Shari discussed her attempts to get some important documents from Ruby after she decided she needed to protect herself from Ruby. She gave the documents to Pam and told Shari that she could pick them up from her at a specific time, which turned out to be a trap because, of course, it is.
Because Ruby, of course, was waiting in the house and said, "Can we talk? Come inside."
Thankfully, she brought along a person who she now calls Mom with her, who seems very supportive of her. Ruby ambushed her and tried to have a conversation. Shari didn't want to have.
She throws out insane shit during this conversation, like, all the sacrifices I've made for you, which is something even my own mom has said in like crazy crash out moments. It seems to be like a
crazy
narcissistic personality disorder mom issue. But yeah, like lots of crazy shit, like all these things I've done for you, all this like wild stuff that's just coming out. Shari said she was like spitting mad at this point. But there was one quote in here that I think particularly stood out as like a very interesting look into Ruby's psyche. She said, "You've always hated me. Ever since you were 5 years old, I could see it in your eyes. The way you looked at me, the way you judged me, you've never appreciated anything I've ever done for you, all the sacrifices I've made." The first part of this, to me,
5 years old,
is wild. That Ruby truly had, like, she believes this. She had this perception that Shari has hated her since she was 5 years old. Like, that Shari was capable of judging her. And, like, obviously this is an obvious look into why potentially Ruby was also so hard on her if she was perceiving that Shari was judging her, which she wasn't. But this is immense projection, right? Like, this is her own stuff that she's mapping onto Shari that really has nothing to do with Shari, right? But to believe that a 5-year-old who doesn't even have, in my opinion, the capacity to hate a person, to understand things in that way. And ironically, the daughter who did everything possible to please and obey her. Like, I can completely relate and understand to Shari in this way, where you have somebody who you basically give into their every whim. You go above and beyond, you caretake, you do things for them that are just not even reasonable. And then for them to look you in the face and be like, you never do anything for me. You don't appreciate anything I've ever done, all the sacrifices I've made. Like, it's such deep, complex wounding to believe a child could be hating you and judging you. And it almost borders on delusion to believe that a child that young could be making those assessments. Like, it almost gives paranoia to me.
Yeah.
Like, you see me the way I see myself. The deep down theory that I think here in its simplest form is that Ruby truly hates herself. Like, I really think she does not like who she is. And when you feel that way about yourself, you see that in everybody's interaction with you. Even with your own children. Which is tragic.
It must be so bad if you can see it in a child.
Uh-huh.
A 5-year-old even, because I look at my kid and that dude is just thinking about Legos. Which is fine. That is appropriate for him.
But that shows how extensive and how important it is to heal that childhood stuff, right? Because it can come up and it can come up strong. And people can feel that and not be a pathological child abuser. Yeah. You just have to know, like, oh, I'm not supposed to be feeling that way.
Yeah.
Like, there's something that's not right there that I need to, I need to get support. I need to get help. I need to work through that and know that that's me, and I can do something to heal that part of myself so that it doesn't come out on my child. It's truly just Shari or Ruby repeating the pattern that I think that she experienced in her own childhood with Shari.
Yeah. That was apparently the last interaction that Shari ever had with Ruby. Though neighbors would keep her updated on things as we suspected, Shari was trying her damnedest to get the authorities to see that her siblings were being abused and neglected. She tried, and the system failed her due to the free-range parenting law in Utah that was passed earlier.
During this process, Shari parallels in her book her experience being groomed and abused by an older man who had what she called a high-up leadership position in the church. Despite the fact that he was vile towards Shari and manipulative and horrible, when she approached her bishop about this issue, it was handled, unfortunately, the way it is handled, in my opinion, the majority of the time, which is, and I've seen this personally, I've seen this professionally, I've seen this all over the place, people I don't know, people I do know, people very close to me, myself. I've constantly seen this pattern where a woman goes to the church with claims of abuse or being sexually abused or being groomed or something that is very explicitly wrong. And instead, the woman who came forward with the information will get punished and the man involved will get nothing. Nothing.
Yep.
So Shari, being scrupulous, OCD tendency kind of causes the urge for confession a lot of time. She felt she needed to confess. That also is along with Mormonism, right? Fornicating is something you have to confess to your bishop. Any kind of sexual thing is something you have to confess to your bishop. So she was honest about it, and they they talked about it. They went to the stake president, and they took her temple recommend away. I mean, mind you, this man, I think she said, was in his 40s or 50s, is married, has his own children, and like very explicitly took advantage of Shari in ways that, if you want to read the details, read her book. I don't think it's something that I need to hash the details out here. Yeah. But she was extremely vulnerable, and he knew exactly what he was doing. Yes, Tom, I agree. Apparently, this other man involved denied the actions to his bishop, and his bishop believed him and believed that nothing happened.
Oh, joy.
And then a month later, her president gave her her temple recommend back. Eventually, she would decide to move wards, I think in part because of the situation, and she got a new bishop, and the new bishop seems to have had her back more and pursued this and actually got the man to have a disciplinary council, which is valid in this situation if the church recognized nothing else but the infidelity.
Seriously.
Like, infidelity usually often involves a disciplinary council, which can end in excommunication. Sometimes will, sometimes won't. Kind of depends on the charges, right? So apparently he ended up having a disciplinary council. She didn't share the results of the disciplinary council. I don't know if she knew or not, but he did get his calling stripped away as another consequence. You know, a lot of people, I was reading in the subreddit the other day, a lot of people were enraged by this. And it enrages me, but honestly, at this point, it enrages me to a point of numbness. Because
it happens.
Sherry's story
so often
happens to people all of the time. And it doesn't mean that her experience is any less traumatic, but it just fucking bewilders me that we constantly stay in this position with no shifting, because out of all the time in the church, all the years I've been in, all the women who have come before me, it seems that we don't ever have a shift in this behavior. Women are always punished. No. Men are always left off the hook. That's just how it goes. That's just how it goes. Like, I got punished for having sex. The guy that I had sex with got married 6 months later and didn't have a single fucking punishment. That's just how it goes in the church. And it shouldn't be that way because it's traumatizing, and the disciplinary process and getting punished for something when you were groomed is not fair. Sherry should have never been punished for any aspect of this, but they're always going to be stingy on the, well, if you touched butts or if you grazed a boob, it counts. It means you participated, therefore you're in trouble. And I don't know how to explain this any other way than just Mormonism is fucked beyond repair. And I don't know how this will ever be fixed, to be honest. I really don't.
Well, and I just wanted to add a little Mormon insight in this. And I don't know what the nature of this was. But the thing that she described in the book was, he said, as kind of like a cover for his actions, that he was an elder in the Holy Melchizedek priesthood and he would never do anything to jeopardize that. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that was edited for conciseness, but an elder is really nothing. It's not high up at all. So if that is the thing, because I was an elder in the Holy Melchizedek priesthood before we left, and I didn't have any sort of leadership calling or anything like that. That was anything high up, because when you become a bishop or a stake president or anything that's really kind of high up at the larger, more regional level or even a general level, you are ordained a high priest in the Melchizedek priesthood, which is very different. In a sense that it's a different title, it's a specific title. Yeah. So an elder implies that you're like a low-level leader, and somehow he was able to... even the lowest of the low, the Aaronic priesthood, have much more authority over women than anyone else out there just because of their priesthood status. It's not like they don't have to be that high up in order to have this power imbalance is basically what I'm getting at.
Yep.
If what she said is exactly what he said, the dude was like no higher than I was, and he still had that power imbalance and was able to use that to his advantage to do something awful. Mm-hmm. So just a little interesting observation. Obviously, it doesn't need to be clarified, but I just thought that was interesting.
And I was also going to say, people in the subreddit, I saw some people, hopefully this is a minority, we're trying to figure out who he is. Please don't do that. She gave him a fake name, probably to protect herself from being sued. Don't jeopardize that for her, please. Just throwing that out there. Then the arrest happens, right? We're not going to recant all of that because we all know.
There was so much.
Right? If you need to rehash your memory, go back to the videos that we have. It did break my heart to read that Sherry thought that the siblings were dead. It broke my heart because, I think we all were worried that that was going to be the case as well in this situation, unfortunately. And as much trauma as they have endured, I'm glad that they are all still here. Some of the details that stood out to me and some of the things that Shari talked about was that Kevin said that Ruby said that during their little 15-minute joint police ride that neither of them said anything. And we long speculated about what that car ride was like, right? But it is, I don't know. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious about why you think they were quiet, because that's not what I expected.
Truly.
It's not what I expected at all. So it fascinates me. And Ruby could be full of shit. Who knows, you know? Kevin also said that he saw Ruby 5 days prior to the arrest and she was trying to get him signed documents to sell their house. She couldn't sell it without him because his name was on the mortgage. And he told Shari that he probably would have signed it if she put it in front of him because of how deep he was in it at the time, but fortunately they didn't. And then Kevin said, Ruby said in her first phone call while she was in prison, that she and Jodi were misunderstood. And she said, quote, "But you know what? Like Joseph Smith, every wonderful man of God has been misunderstood. I'm going to get out of this." And she also said, "God spoke to me when I was driving before I called you. The Spirit said your children are going to be removed." She also said she didn't understand why her children were in the hospital. They were perfectly fine. This is the extent of the delusion here. Seeing the state of those children, knowing Ruby was involved in getting them to that state, from the journals, from the evidence, like to me, this is a extreme mental health issue. This is pathological that she truly doesn't see anything wrong with those kids who were so in such horrid condition that people were wondering if they were going to survive this. Like, that's just how deep these things were going at the time.
She also said that her fear was palpable in prison. She confessed her terror of being attacked, writing she was constantly on edge, afraid she might be shanked at any moment. Dear God, I'm so sorry for you.
No one feels bad.
Nobody feels bad.
Nobody feels bad.
Shari described her experience at Ruby's hearing, frustrated at her willingness to absolve herself of participating in the abuse and resting on the assumption that Jodi had corrupted her. She called them hollow words, especially for no acknowledgement of the horrible things she did before Jodi even came into the picture. She wonders if Ruby will ever comprehend her actions and experience genuine remorse. And I feel like this is something that we also hit on when we were talking about it. Like, it feels like she's able to just cry. And unfortunately, because of the nature of what Jodi does so well, it feels like that is going to be kind of the general assumption, is that she was just under Jodi's spell.
Yep.
And she experiences nothing. But I mean, for a long time, we were like, no, people don't just get to the point where they allow someone to abuse their children like that. You have to, at some point along the way, you become a willing participant, even if it is through your complacency.
And I think if there is a serious mental health issue going on, which I think is very reasonable at this point, not being able to experience remorse would fall under that category. Like lack of empathy, not able to feel remorse, getting joy out of punishing people, that would all kind of fall under a mental health issue. It would make sense that she wouldn't be able to. And then in terms of Jodi's part of the hearing, apparently, she was making calls to followers, referring to herself as a prophet, saying she was like Joseph Smith, and saying she was speaking directly to God. We've got really strong delusions here.
Yapping.
Shari said that she was surprised that she actually spoke, but wasn't surprised, like, at the nature of what she said, that, she just said a bunch of bullshit about how she loves those kids. Yeah, I bet you she really believes she does. I bet you she has bought into that entirely because she believes that love is abuse. So she does believe that she loves those children because she's abusing them. Towards the end of the book, she kind of wraps everything up by saying Kevin is now back in their former home. Shari describes Kevin as making huge strides and is also in therapy. He's apparently since gotten like 2 puppies and eventually a cat, which Shari also got a cat.
Shout out to the kitties.
He said the kids are free to decorate their rooms as they wished. She said the house actually feels like a home and it feels lived in now. And she describes having forgiven Kevin. So I want to read you exactly what she says. "I would never forget the pain he caused, ignored, and enabled. He had not been absolved, but I had to release the burden of resentment I held against him. And extending a hand of compassion and understanding, I was granting myself the freedom to heal." In this instance, I don't think a lot of us have authority to have a real thorough opinion of Kevin because there's still so much that we don't know and understand, and we never will. So I wish people would defer to Shari's insight here. She words it perfectly. Like, she's never going to forget the things that he did that were painful for her. She never will. But she also is willing to move forward and forgive him because he actually seems to be remorseful and willing to work on things and willing to go to therapy and do things. And I think that speaks to a lot of his character as a person. And she also says that Ruby writes Kevin letters, but they go unanswered. So I think that about shares their relationship there. And, you know, people ask about their sealing, you know, because they were sealed in the temple.
What I was going to get to. Yeah, because they have, I mean, he's filed for divorce, and I think that's probably still in the works. Anecdotally, the whole sealing process is kind of interesting, the way that it gets dissolved. I don't even think even through excommunication does it get dissolved.
You have to petition for it if you do.
have to petition for it, and usually that only happens when you are looking to be sealed to a new person that you want to be married to, because you can only be sealed to one living person at a time for men, or for women especially, but men, everybody has to be sealed to only one living person. If you have a wife that dies, then you can be sealed to another woman. And anyway, we won't get too much into the weeds on that one.
It's a little complicated.
But anecdotally, I know of someone who was in our ward who was trying to get married, and they had to get approval from the other spouse, and she was being difficult to have their sealing dissolved. They have to set it up with the bishop, and it has to go through the leadership all the way up to the first presidency and the prophet to approve the dissolution of the sealing. So it is a process, and it doesn't usually happen until you are married. You're going to get sealed with your new spouse. So
other circumstances to approve that are fairly rare.
Yeah,
I have never heard about any others.
They wouldn't ever kind of like talk about it publicly or whatever, because it's really no one's business. But
I feel like they'd honor Kevin's request if he went through with it, to be honest.
I feel like it would be a special circumstance, having an incarcerated...
It'd go straight to the prophet, that's for
former
sure.
spouse. I feel like it would be fairly easy, but honestly, I don't know if they are still sealed or not.
It's hard to say.
They could be, and it sounds like Ruby is intent on maintaining her membership and is probably going to be making strides. We haven't heard of any sort of disciplinary council or anything like that, and they won't ever make any sort of...
They won't ever say.
It is very seldom that they ever make any statements on disciplinary counsel to the press or anything like that. We can only speculate on that front. Ultimately, I don't believe in the sealing. I think it's bullshit anyway. It doesn't really matter to me. But obviously, for victims of a crime that is so awful, I would hope that if they petitioned to church,
that they would honor it.
They would honor it, even for the children to be separated from her, because I don't think that's fair to them when they still believe in that kind of thing. Just a little insight on, I know a lot of people were asking about that.
It's complicated. It would make sense why you're asking, because it's not easy to understand. So Shari said Ruby sent her a letter at some point, and she said it missed the mark, like laughably so. Apparently she wrote 5 pages, and almost half of it was describing Shari's nursery and the excitement of preparing it and speaking of Shari like only as a baby. This isn't uncommon, especially with people with narcissistic personality disorder. They like children who can be easily controlled and who will validate their sense of self-image, which is often a baby, because they're never going to push back on you. There was no apology or acknowledgement. She said her only regret that Ruby mentioned was not spending more time with Shari before she left for college. And to me, this solidifies a lot of what we see in the narcissistic aspects of Ruby's behavior. A false reality and delusion that exists in their own mind to... She has her own perceptions on this that she believes, and they're probably wrong, and they might not even exist.
Right.
But they believe them, and they cling to them like a lifeline. And I personally, like, my theory is narcissism sometimes serves as protection from pain. And I don't know that truly Ruby would be able to live with herself if she were to truly
sit with
reckon and acknowledge the pain that she has caused and what she has done. So like, you know, the mental health struggle, the mental health disorder here that's potential is essentially a shield that keeps her going. Like narcissism sometimes can serve as a lifeline for people. It's like, you know, seeing an oasis in a desert. Like they will cling to the oasis. Doesn't matter if people around them are dying of thirst. Like they're going to cling.
Yeah.
Because it's much easier to go on living her delusional reality where her only mistake was getting involved with Jodi. If she even believes that, who knows? That could be total bullshit too.
Right.
And not spending enough time with her kids. Like that's just how deep this altered reality goes. Like it's highly unlikely she'll let go of it because it serves as such a severe protection. And I don't want to say that narcissistic personality disorder is something that people can't heal from, because they can. It can be managed. You know, there's evidence-based therapy for it, medication. There's all kinds of things that can help with this. It's just whether or not somebody's willing to pursue it, because you have to recognize that there's a problem. And Ruby isn't interested in doing that because it will shatter her whole perception. Everything will come crumbling down.
And obviously let it serve as a reminder that people with NPD are not inherently evil or dangerous or anything like that. Some people who are evil and dangerous happen to be have those sorts of traits.
And it's all speculation. Like I'm not Ruby's therapist. No, none of us will know. We like the only thing that we can do like as a mental health professional is look at patterns and see if behavior lines up, but it's all speculative because there could be serious traumas that Ruby has suffered that maybe we'll never know or understand, and that could be contributing to why she believes certain things or lives a certain way. Yeah. Or maybe there's a genetic, you know, personality disorder that runs in the family, or you know, something of that nature. Like, it's hard to say. It's all speculative.
I think that if she ever truly were able to acknowledge the awful things that she committed and the harm that she caused, she would probably be begging for someone to shank her in prison.
That's what I think. I think it really protects her. And Shari talks about narcissistic personality disorder at the end of the book and seems to be confident that Ruby has it. Again, I don't think her assessment is far off just from looking at it from kind of a isolated behavioral standpoint. It makes sense.
She ends with, as for Jodi, I'll leave her diagnosis to the experts and the fate of her soul to God. Which is pretty chilling.
That is chilling.
Honestly.
I mean, I kind of wanted to end there.
Dust your hands and be like, all done.
I think Jodi has something more severe than Ruby, in my opinion. I think Jodi's goes deeper than what Ruby experiences. Like, Jodi almost makes me wonder, like, her behavioral patterns are consistent with things that we would see with, like, antisocial personality disorder. Again, it's all speculative just based on a one-dimensional view that we have that isn't accurate, generally speaking. Who even knows, because of the persona that she puts forward. But she almost certainly comes off worse because of the things that she's done.
Seeing the way that she's able to destroy people's lives, and it's happened more than once in the way that she's done it,
it's a serious pattern.
It definitely begs the question of what is going on there, because I don't think that this person is safe to live with the rest of us.
No, I don't.
Truly,
I think she's a danger.
A danger to other people, because she has destroyed families and lives.
And seems to enjoy it.
Yeah. Continues to do it constantly. So
there's some very specific things that goes into things like antisocial personality disorder. But I think, you know, from this one-dimensional view, it would not be a stretch to see some of those things line up quite nicely. And that, I mean, that's severe. It's a very severe end of the spectrum that would require a lot of help and support and acknowledgement and sitting with reality. And I don't know that that's something that Jodi is capable of either, because she also has a lot of pain.
At the end of it all, we don't want to focus on Ruby or Jodi, despite them being the perpetrators of this. We want to focus on the fact that Shari and Kevin and Chad and the other children are finally free from these monsters. They're able to do some healing, and they're able to finally live a life that could be possibly as normal as it could be after an awful series of despicable events like that.
Yeah.
It's, you know, like we said before, if this is the last thing and then the documentary is the last thing after that. If we never hear from them, if that is what they wish, that would be preferred, honestly.
Yeah.
They deserve to finally live a life in peace and quiet, away from the internet, and not have to be analyzed or used as evidence or,
Yeah. That's
employees or anything to fuel the machine that was feeding into Ruby's addiction, essentially, of,
Yeah.
of attention and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when she was just being awful all the time behind the scenes and being cold and thinking that a 5-year-old is judging her. And
Mm-hmm. There's lots of, this seems to be a very strong narrative of generational trauma, in my opinion. I think we see generational trauma on Ruby's side and on Jodi's side very heavily manifesting here. And I think this is testament to why healing, when you've experienced that from previous generations, is so essential, because this is why cycle breakers are so important. Like, Shari is a cycle breaker through and through. Like, she's talked about, she wants to have her own children. She wants it to be different. Like, she wants that life. And I don't think she understands the impact that she will have on the family line that she creates, because she has effectively decided to heal and stopped this bullshit from continuing to perpetuate. And it is very exhausting and difficult to be a cycle breaker. So I cannot appreciate her enough for the role that she's had and the tremendous impact that she will make for generations to come. Like, it can't be overstated. Like, it can't be overstated what she's done and been willing to do. And, even though people, lots of people wonder why she's still in the Mormon church and things. And, at the height of when I was being abused by my own mother, I leaned heavily into the church because it was the only thing that felt solid to me. Like, I leaned, like, the most active I've ever been, the most dedicated, the most intense, the strongest testimony I've ever had was at the height of my life crumbling. And I do not blame her at all for wanting to lean into the thing that seems the most solid and normal out of everything that she's experienced. And it sounds like she has a more nuanced and progressive approach to Mormonism, which I can always appreciate. Got to make room for people who view it their way, who aren't homophobic and hopefully not transphobic and things. I think we can extend a lot of credit for her for living that way. But when people are like, why does she still stay in the church this way? Like, I don't blame her, honestly.
Yeah.
I don't blame her.
And, when we always say that when people's paradigm shifts, it might be a ticking clock for some of that to all come crumbling down. She might see that it is a pattern within the Mormon church to protect predators and abusers and even put them on pedestals, because we know that Jodi had a very strong relationship with the church and with LDS Family Services for a very long time. And when that finally ran out, then she found connections elsewhere. So maybe Shari will see it at some point. She is still a student at BYU.
So she's got to be.
So there's that aspect of it as well. So maybe once she leaves that.
I don't see her leaving, honestly, to be quite honest.
We'll see. We'll see what happens. But hopefully we don't ever have to find out. And
I personally don't care whether she stays or goes. I just want her to live a happy, normal life, whatever that looks like for her. Her own brand of Mormonism, Mormon 2.0. I don't care. Like, as long as she's happy.
That whole family went through the ringer.
They deserve to
Jodi's
have whatever
family
they want.
had the cycle breakers, and instead of Jodi just fizzling out and having a little temper tantrum to herself, she decided to go on and ruin other people's lives.
Yeah, and make it a mess for everybody else.
And, she's like, oh, your kids are going to be cycle breakers? Yeah, well...
guess what?
Yeah.
I'm about to make it everybody's problem.
Everybody's problem.
But all in all, incredible book, incredible writing.
Yep.
I think she did a great job. She injected humor. She talked about wanting this to be it. Like, she put it all out there. There's nothing left to talk about. She reclaimed the narrative in her way, in the way that she wanted to put it out there, her truth. And she did it in a really great way, and highly recommend. Like, there's still plenty of things in here that we didn't talk about. So go buy it, go read it, go support her, whatever that looks like.
If you're like me, listen to it.
Listen to it.
She reads.
Yeah, she did it herself.
In her own words. I've heard a lot of good things about people saying that. Hearing it from her mouth is probably pretty awesome. So
go read that.
If you enjoyed seeing this, if you would like to see more of it.
If you've been here from the beginning.
If you've been here from the beginning, you already know. Hit that subscribe button. Join the over 100,000 subscribers. We would love to have you. We love every one of you. You've gotten us here. You allow us to keep doing this, and you're awesome. And thank you for being here. If you'd like to support us further, you can become a member of the channel and gain early access to the episodes and stuff like this. If this one ends up being 2 parts, then the second part you'll have access to even earlier, because I'll just as soon as I get it done, put it up for everybody. And then you can also join Patreon. It's the same thing as YouTube membership. YouTube membership is a little more intuitive. It's integrated into YouTube. You're already right here. Check it out. If Patreon is more your flavor, go and check that out. The link is down in the description down below. We also have social media. One of them is probably on the way out, TikTok. Rest in peace, apparently. And Instagram. We have both of those. You can find us at Jordan and McKay for both of those. We post a lot of more up-to-the-minute updates with Instagram, because Jordan's always on Instagram posting the stories and shit like that, because it's just really easy. So check that out. Follow us there. Check out our cats and the stupid shit that we come across on the internet. We also have an awesome Discord community. You can find the invite to that down below. Essential for when we're doing watch parties and stuff like that. So if you're interested in like the watch parties that we do with the patrons and members, that is something that you're going to want to get onto quickly. And then I think that is it. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us. I know we've been long-winded, but I think all of this is really important stuff, and stuff that you might not find out there on the internet, other than people just, reading the book and saying, hey, here's what it says.
And we wanted to give you more than that.
We wanted to give you more than that. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for sticking with us. We love you. You're awesome. And we will see you next time.